Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look at something I like to call setup play. So, how do we face like a really passive setup? Like, let's say, for example, our opponent opens up the game with a move like d3, and he has the intentions of playing a really passive setup. So let's just say that we were to, theoretically move our knight back and forth, like knight f6, knight f3, knight g8, and this was kind of his intended passive setup. This would be more like a King's Indian attack kind of setup. What is the correct way to respond to this as black, and how should we try to take advantage of these kind of early passive systems where our opponent doesn't intend on crossing past the third rank? So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So I think one of the first things that we have to realize is when we're talking about these passive openings, I think that a lot of our early chess education kind of does us a little bit of a disservice. Because what we're always being taught is, if you're not grabbing the center of the board right away with e4 and d4, that, basically you're not doing anything, you're not attacking the center of the board, and that your moves have nothing to do with the center. And of course, this can't be, further from the truth. I mean, even a wing move, like h4, certainly does have something to do with the middle of the board. Because as your understanding of the center of the board progresses, you start understanding that the center of the board really is a much bigger area than you think it is. Because if you look at the center, typically we define the center as just these 16 squares. It's this 4x4 area. And that's fair. Okay, so we define the center as pretty much any square where a knight is going to control 8 squares. And that's fair enough, right? But if we just want to mathematically define even just this knight, and ask ourselves, where is that knight going to be most powerful in the middle of the board? We would actually have to break it down into 3 subsets of squares. We would have to break it down into the corner squares where the knight is the least powerful, the 4 center squares where the knight is the most powerful, and then of course these remaining squares is the third subset of squares where the knight is the second most powerful. So if we start looking at, like, I want to improve the position of my knight from, say, the f3 square to the f4 or f5 square, both of which are significantly better than the f3 square. And if you're curious why this is a mathematical thing, it's not just measuring can my knight move to 8 squares, it's how many of the squares that my knight can move to can also have my knight move to 8 squares. And that's why we have these 3 subsets of squares. The knight on f4 and f5 touches more squares that control more squares than the knight on f3. So it's not just the primary squares that the knight controls, but also the secondary squares that the knight controls. How many squares can the knight get to in a combination of 2 moves, not just 1 move? So there is this mathematical thing. Now, if you want to plant a knight on f4 or f5, you need to control the squares next to it. So that means you would have to control g4 or g5 respectively. How do you control g4 or g5? Well, with an h-pawn. So yes, the h-pawn does have something to do with the center of the board. Quite often in so many different openings, like a French defense, or if I were to show you a Gurgenitz opening, like let's say we start with e4, and then black plays this passive sort of Gurgenitz setup with c6 and g6. And then you play like an early f4, and I play d5, and you play e5. Well, if I want to plant a knight permanently on this f5 square, first I'm going to need to control a pawn from moving to g4 to kick it away. So I would probably play the move pawn to h5 here. And that is in fact the theoretical move in this position, is just to play pawn h5 and to etch out this square for this knight to go from h6 to f5. So a move like pawn to h5 or a move like pawn to h4 does in fact have something to do with the center. So the first thing you have to do when you start seeing these passive early setups is kind of get it out of your head that it's as easy as just planting your pawns in the middle of the board and just declaring, that you have an advantage. Certainly, you're not going to be significantly worse if you just try to play an early d5 and e5 and call it a day. But at the same time, it oversimplifies everything that's going on. So what's really going on is if we go back and we look at, okay, this is the setup White's trying to achieve, we need to ask ourselves, what is really kind of the most ideal setup that we can achieve with the black pieces that's going to work against a setup like this? So what you're doing is you're comparing your setup to your opponent's setup, and you're trying to decide which setup is going to be the best approach. And then you're trying to keep that in mind with each and every single move that your opponent makes, because every time they're going to make a different move, even behind this third rank, they're changing the number of setups that are possible for them. So if they play this immediate d3 and their intention is to follow it up, like if you play d3, d5, and then they follow it up with, say, c3, well, there's going to be a lot of different setups now that are going to involve pawn to c3 that didn't exist a move ago. So you could end up playing some sort of King's Indian attack setup that's going to end up looking a little bit different because this pawn is on c3 versus this pawn being back on c2. So you're going to have to keep those King's Indian setups in mind. And they might also be going for something completely different. So there might be other setups that they might be aiming for. They might be aiming for setups involving now with a3 and b4 and things like this. And this whole time you have to start thinking about what kind of setups you want with black, and you have to start thinking about other mainline theoretical variations. So naturally, the people that do the best in these sort of non-theoretical sort of passive setups are actually the people that know the most theory. Because a lot of times we're looking at like reverse systems, like what's going to work best once my opponent decides to play a King's Indian setup, or if I think this is the direction he's going, which setup is going to give me the best chances to equalize as black or even get a better position as black? Should I try to play a reverse classical variation, where I advance all my pawns to, c5, d5, e5, and then I play like a classical setup with knight f6? Should I try a reverse same-ish setup with like a pawn on f6? Can I pull these setups off? With the given move orders? Considering that white might be able to strike in the middle early with a move like c4 or e4 once I'm, doing these setups and trying to set them up. Is he going to strike in the middle early with, c4 or d4? And is that going to be a different setup? Is that going to be now a reverse Benoni? And what are exactly the consequences of having a reverse Benoni setup? So you have to think about all these setups, and you have to think about the consequences of these setups. Now, if you're anything like me, I was kind of a little lazy on preparing for these types of things. I really didn't, if somebody played an early d3 against me, there were a couple setups that I knew that this could transpose into that I knew were going to be approximately level or were going to be okay for black. So the main thing that I would do is I don't want to lose any cost equity in terms of moves, and I don't want to be down a tempo in a main line that I'm not familiar with. So one of the things that I wouldn't try to do is I wouldn't try to go for these big centers, because playing a reverse samish means that I'm going to be playing a reverse Benoni, and I'm going to be a tempo down. And I know that these are super short positions, so I know a tempo is important. I know that a tempo means a lot in these super short positions. I've played the Benoni with the black pieces, so I know that going into a reverse Benoni is going to be a decision that's kind of dangerous. So one of the things that I would do is I would usually respond to early d3s with either, c5, or I would respond with either knight f6, because I know that this is going to inevitably become one of two lines. This is going to either become some sort of symmetrical English, or it's going to become a King's Indian setup against a Sicilian. And I'm really familiar with the King's Indian setups against a Sicilian. So it's an opening that I've already studied very well, and I already have a lot of theory on it, and I already know approximately what the move orders are. And it's basically just going to be a direct transposition. I mean, keep in mind, a move like d3 on the first move, you really shouldn't be expecting anything more than equality with black. d3 by itself is not a bad enough first move to declare that white has lost the advantage. It's a central pawn move. It's in the middle of the board. He can follow up with another central pawn move like either e4 or c4. He can take his share of the center, and he hasn't lost anything in terms of move equity. So you shouldn't really be looking for an advantage with black against d3. You should be looking for an easy setup that you can play against it that'll equalize. So I would recommend something like c5, and then when they start going for their setup, you just start going for yours. Knight f6, g3, g6, bishop g7, bishop g2. They can castle, you can castle. And now they really have to hit this decision point here. They're going to have to play either c4 or e4. Now, in either case, I'm playing well within my theoretical bounds. if they play pawn to c4, I'm playing my main line symmetrical English without any deviations. I would have gotten the same thing out of c4, c5 on the first move. If they play e4, I'm going to be playing a mainline closed Sicilian without any deviations, with the knight on f3. So, and actually, I think that the knight on f3 lines, like if you take a look at the knight on f3, knight on b to d2 lines, I really don't think these are the most challenging lines that black has to face. I actually have a lot more difficulties with the lines that involve putting the knight on e2 and putting the other knight on c3. So I'm really not that concerned about these lines from a theoretical perspective, and I feel like in these lines, black usually equalizes fairly easily without a whole lot of fight. But more importantly, I don't have to memorize a whole new theoretical line just to play against every single possible weird passive early setup that white can choose. I can simply kind of go into a holding pattern with my moves and wait for them to commit to a setup, and then I'm right back in my theoretical preparation. So anyways, that's how you handle passive, slow setups that you might come across with the black pieces. And of course, there are dozens of ways that people can approach this with white. And I might do more videos in the future on other first moves that white can try that are super passive, and how we can approach those with setups to make it easy for us to prepare with the black pieces. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.